Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yeah, we can hear you pretty well. Do you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
My name is Leonora Verila. This is Alexei Panchak. We are going to discuss today Holodomor problem in Ukraine.
And we'd like to know something about you.
Well, my name is Jacob, and I'll be one of the attorneys representing Joseph Stalin in this trial today. And my partner should be here shortly, but she's not here at this time.
It's
Are
not a
we ready to
problem.
begin yet?
So it's not a problem. We'll wait for her.
Oh no, it's fine. If you want to begin, you can go ahead.
Oh, thank you. First of all, we would like to introduce our position. We are going to be applicants in order to consider the Holodomor as a genocide. First of all, I would like to start with a plan. I have a few, just a few reasons, and the first one is because of the international political arena, which posed an extreme necessity in extra funds, Joseph Stalin. And this posed the lack of legal opportunities to achieve the same success that the USA completed Plan B. So Joseph Stalin was aimed to complete and to create actually his hardware plan of modernization, which really injured and harmed people of Ukraine and all the population all over the ethnical territories of Ukraine. So it's our position. And I would also like to add that the objective damage caused by Russian Empire authorities caused starvation, first at the urban areas and then at suburban, and then it just transferred in the center. And also it caused mass deaths. And there was also a problem with children. My main line was homeless children who were sent to orphanages, and then there were also a problem of cannibalism.
In addition, the Ukrainian famine, which I try to consider, was a direct famine premeditated by the Soviet Union, headed by Joseph Stalin during the 2932 and 2933, as a means to undermine the nationalistic pride of the Ukrainian people. We strongly believe that it serves to control and further oppress the basic vital essentials for the Ukrainian people really needed to survive. The Ukrainian famine is also well known throughout the world as the Holodomor, which means death by hunger. The communist regime sought to eliminate any threat from Ukrainian nationalists, whom they fear the potential to form a rebellion to seek independence from the Soviet Union. More than 5,000 Ukrainian intellectuals were arrested and later were also accused of plotting an armed rebellion, which caused a terrible disastrous effect because they were sent to Siberia and most of them were killed. Well, in our position, Mr. Stalin did not want the Ukrainian peasants to prosper freely from the wealth accumulated from independent farm holdings. The wealthier farmers were termed as kulaks and became the primary target of decolonization. An effort which meant an effort to eliminate the farm holdings and create collective farm units. However, the communists attempt to gain the support of the poorer class of peasants by turning them against the black class of farmers. A false image of black was portrayed of black class was portrayed them as a danger to society. Contrary to the expected outcome of the communist plan, the poor farmers sided with the cause instead of siding with the Soviet authority. As a result, many of them became new targets of depoliticization, and many other poor farmers unwillingly joined collective farm. Those who attempted to aid the poor were punished under the law. The Soviet police confiscated the Ukrainian farmers of their home, livestock, and valuable possessions. Moreover, they imposed heavy grain taxes, deliberately leaving families to starve. And those who resisted giving up their homes and crops were violently shot to death and deported to regions in Siberia. Well, taking everything this into consideration, we strongly possess Mr. Stalin and the communist regime, which was a dominating force in the Soviet Union at this time. The main murderers and the main threat of this horrible disaster, which appeared with our nation at the 30 years of the previous century.
Well, that was a historical background of my counselor. And now I would like to just tell you an example. We found an article about Holodomor, and I would like to read it for you. At the same time, I can illustrate with my personal example that all Ukrainians were aware of the Holodomor. It could hardly have been otherwise. My grandmother Natalia told me about the Holodomor from the time I was 10. She recalled facts of such horror from my family, neighbors, and relatives lived during these famine years that I will probably never dare to speak about them publicly. My grandmother Natalia was born in the Poltava Oblast, Reshetitsky Rayon, Nikori village. What happened in Ukraine in 1932-33? Stalin and other Soviet leaders engineered and imposed a great famine on Ukraine, its aim being a total extermination on Ukrainian peasantry. From a rational point of view, it is difficult to understand why the totalitarian system needed to kill people whom it would force to be the system's slaves. In order to get some understanding on what happened in 1932-33, the history of the Russian Empire and Ukraine's relations with it should be taken into consideration. Specifically, the fact that Ukraine was a Russian colony for more than 300 years. Russia has always attempted to claim as its own not only Ukrainian territory and resources, but also Ukraine's history and even its name. The historical medieval Kiev Rus underwent a Stalin and rather strange transformation can compete according to the political requirements of the Imperial Russian state and restricted a modern Russia. Along the same lines, the Ukrainian capital Kiev was proclaimed Mother of Russian states. In such a political climate, native Ukrainian nationalism posed a danger to the imperial ideology by rejecting Russian occupation and arguing for the creation of an independent Ukrainian state. As Ukrainians were mostly peasant people, Stalin directed his main attack on the Ukrainian countryside. He was aimed to stabilize the economy. That's true, but his methods are just unapplicable and unacceptable. Um, According to the 1984 Convention of the United Nations, the genocide is a commitment with intent to destroy in whole with part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. It also defines the signs of genocide. Action aimed at the partial or total destruction of such groups are killing members of the group, causing them serious bodily and mental disorders, international infliction of conditions of life calculated of physical destruction of the group, measures which prevent births within the group, of course, transporting children of the group to another group. A lot of people at this time were sent to orphanages, and they were brought with the totalitarian and communism ideology. So that was the main goal of the Stalin, and he reached this goal.
And furthermore, despite many Ukrainian communist leaders' objections to Stalin and his decrees, Stalin continued to raise grain quotas, which led to worsening of the famine. Many communists blamed the orchestrated famine on an unsuccessful harvest and crop yield. Failing to acknowledge the crimes perpetrated by the Soviet government and authorities, it is estimated. However, it is estimated that more than 10 million people died as a result of violent executions, deportation, and starvation. It seems a ridiculous number, doesn't it? What's more, currently Russia does not recognize the Ukrainian famine of Holodomor as genocide. The Russian State's Duma has stated that there was starvation in many parts of the Soviet Union, and it is insulting and incorrect to the Ukrainians being the Soviet directly targeted. Despite Russia's persistent denial of the Ukrainian famine, many countries around the world recognize that Russia's crime committed against the Ukrainian people as genocide, and as my colleague has previously mentioned, this was declared as a special convention.
The next argument of opponents is that motive perpetrators were Ukrainian. Some part Ukrainian actually participated in the crime, but the main organizers and customers were not Ukrainians. But the convention does not say that the crime is only genocide when it's committed by representatives of other nationalities. The Soviet leadership wanted to starve the Ukrainians as the representative of a nation. It's a discrimination, and according to nowadays law, it's just unacceptable. Thus, we feel that the famine has national colors. The greatest losses were exactly in the Ukrainian land or Ukrainian ethnic lands like Cuban. This nation was a threat to the existence of the USSR. Can we blame Stalin in the Holodomor? Yes, we can, because he taught this method, and yes, he chose collectivization, carried out exactly according to his plan. Of course, this was a quick way, industrial and economic development. He chose not to take effective measures. He chosen to have like industrialization within a large people within it, and then he could be compared with millions of victims. Even didn't give them a chance to escape. Nowadays, published a letter of January 22 of 1933, prepared personally by Stalin, in which he ordered to prevent a mass leaving of peasants from Ukraine and Cuban and other regions of the USSR. For that reason, local leaders banned issue according to travel documents for the peasants, however, installing barriers at railway and water transport as well as taking control of the roads. They couldn't even escape, and this was just it was the right of people to go whenever they want, just basic freedom of people. I want to add that the famine was hidden. There was opinions talked about in the press and other media, not only in Ukraine but also internationally. No humanitarian support from abroad was not permitted in Ukraine. USSR simply lied that there was no famine and the country is wonderful. When a French politician area in 1933 visited Kharkiv, especially for him on the street, was a good show with professional actors, and they had to portray happy Ukrainians who lived perfectly in the USSR, although they actually were not. Finally, today, the Holodomor recognized the genocide of the Ukrainian nation in more than 23 countries. The United States recognized and condemned these on the October of 2003. Famine was genocide, not just hunger. It is known all over the world. Discussion of which I do not consider appropriate. Also think we should have a considerable courage and cruelty to discredit such disrespect memory of 5 million people dying horribly.
In conclusion, the nowadays modern international law considers Holodomor as a deliberate act of famine. And on November 28 in 2006, the Parliament of Ukraine adopted a law that recognized the artificial famine in Ukraine as a genocide committed against the Ukrainian people. The law also made public a denial of the Ukrainian genocide illegal. And the Ukrainian genocide commemoration day is on November 26th.
We can.
And we'd like to know your point of view and your position on this topic.
Thank you. My partner, Alondra Montezuma, is now here and she'll deliver our first argument, and then I'll speak over the second argument, and perhaps after that we can have some questions for each other. So my partner will begin.
Hello, my name is Alondra Montezuma, and I'll begin the first argument. May I please the court, Your Honor? My partner Jacob Shaw and I, Alondra Montezuma, will represent Joseph Stalin today in this trial. Something therefore always remains that sticks from the impudent lies. The size of the lie is the defining factor causing it to be believed. Adolf Hitler. Simply put, the so-called evidence tries to tie Joseph Stalin to a famine in the Ukraine is nothing more than a pure fabrication of facts. One of the very set of this is so-called trumped-up evidence was created by William Randolph Hearst, the famous newspaper owner who got the U.S. in war with Spain over the sinking of a battleship Maine in Cuba. The myth concerning the famine in the Ukraine. One of the first campaigns of Hearst's press against the Soviet Union revolved around the question of the million alleged to have died as a result of the Ukraine famine. This campaign began on 8th February 1935 with a front headline in the Chicago American, 6 million people died of hunger in the Soviet Union. Using material supplies by Nazi Germany, William Hearst, the press baron, and Nazi sympathizers began to publish fabricated stories about a genocide, which was supposed to have been deliberately penetrated by the Bolsheviks and had caused several million to die of starvation in the Ukraine. The truth of the matter was altogether different. In fact, what took place in the Soviet Union at the beginning of the 1930s was a major class struggle which poor landless peasants had risen up against the rich landowner, the Ku Klux, and began a struggle of collectivization, a struggle to form colhozes. This great struggle involved directly and indirectly some of 120 million peasants, certainly gave rise to instability in agricultural production, of food storage in some regions. Lack of food did weaken people, which in turn led an increase of number of falling victims to epidemic disease. The disease were at the time regrettably common throughout the world. Between 1918 and 1920, an epidemic of Spanish flu caused the death of 20 million people in the US and Europe, but nobody accused the government of these countries of killing their own citizens. The fact is that there was nothing the government could do in the face of epidemics of the kind. It was only with the development of penicillin during the Second World War that it became possible for such epidemics to be effectively contained. This did not become generally available until towards the end of the 1940s. The Harris Press article asserting that millions were dying of famine in the Ukraine, a famine supposedly deliberately provoked by the communists, went into graphic and lurid detail. The Harris Press used every means possible to make their lies seem like the truth and succeeded in causing public opinion in the capitalist countries to turn sharply against the Soviet Union. This was the origin of the first giant myth manufacture alleging millions were dying in the Soviet Union. In the wave of protests against the supposedly communists provoked famine with the Western press unleashed. Nobody was interested in listening to the Soviet Union's denial and complete exposure of the Harris Press lies, a situation which prevailed from 1934 until 1987. For more than 50 years, several generations of people the world over brought a diet of these slanders to harbor a negative view of socialism in the Soviet Union. Much of what based on nothing more than made-up stories to sell a newspaper. The second set of fabrication came in the late 1980s when a Canadian movie producer made a movie, Harvest of Despair. The movie was reported to be a documentary about the horror of the Holodomor. But we need at this time look at this movie much more closer. The girl is dying. She looks about 5 years old, but we know she might be older. Diminished by the hunger, she leans wearily against the gate. Her long hair falls length about bare shoulders. Her head rests against her arms. Her neck is bent like a stalk in parched earth. Her eyes at the worst, large and dark. Glazed yet wistful, the child is dying, starving, and we feel guilty for our witness. The Ukrainian immigrants who had made Harvest of Despair knew a gripping image when they saw one. The black and white still, played overarching minor mode chorus, was chosen to close the Canadian documentary on the Ukraine famine on 1932 to 33. The same photography was used to promote the film, to symbolize a long dormant cause to celebrate a man-made famine deliberately engineered by Stalin to crush Ukrainian nationalists and cast stubborn peasantry into permanent collectivization. 7 million Ukrainians were killed. The narrative tells us that a nation of the size France was strangled by hunger. The result intoned William F. Bunkley, whose firing line showed that last November was perhaps the greatest Holocaust of the century. The term Holocaust still burns in our ears, even if in our jaded time, as we the film and see corpses piled in fields, bloated bodies sprawled in the streets, pale skeletons gasping for bits of bread, we wonder, how can such a terrible story have been suppressed so long? Here is how. The story is a fraud. The starving girl, turns out, wasn't in 1932 or in 1933, nor in the Ukraine. Her pictures was taken from a Red Cross bulletin on the 1921 and 22 Volga famine, for which no one claims genocide. Rather than emblem of persecution, the photograph advanced more cynical of swindless, a hoax played out with the White House and Congress throughout the halls of Harvard to the New York State Department of Education. Pressing every pedal, pulling all the strings, Ukrainian nationalist lobby straining to cloak its own history of Nazi collaboration. By revising their past, these immigrants report more ambitious revisionism, a denial of Hitler's Holocaust against the Jews. There were indeed a famine in the Ukraine in the early 1930s. It appeared likely that hundreds and thousands of possibly 1 or 2 million Ukrainians died, the minority from starvation, the majority from related disease. By any scale, this is the numbers of toll of human suffering. By general consensus, Stalin was particularly responsible by any stretch of an honest imagination, and tragedy falls short of genocide. In 1932, the Soviet Union was in crisis. The cities had suffered food shortage since 1928. Grain was desperately needed for exports in foreign capital, both to fuel the 5-year plan and to counter the ground war threat from Germany. In addition, the communist left wing, led by Stalin, had come to reject the new economy plan, which restored market capitalism into the countryside in 1920s. In the context, collectivization was more than a vehicle for a cheap and steady grain supply to the state. It was a truly revolution from above, a drastic move towards socialism and epochal change in the mode of production. There were heavy casualties on both sides. Hundreds of thousands of Kuklets, rich peasants, deported to the north. Thousands of party activists assassinated. Production suspended politics, and many presents where thousands of party activists were concerned rather than want to collect farms. Vast destruction of 1932 harvest ensued, and many areas were hard-pressed to meet the state's grain requisition quotas. Again, Stalin and Politburo played major roles, but there's plenty of blame to go around. As Sovietologist John Arch Getty recently noted, the London Review of Books, it must be shared by thousands of activists and officials who carry out a policy by the peasants who choose to slaughter animals, burning fields, and boycott cultivation in protest. Such a balanced analysis, however, has never satisfied Ukrainian nationalists in the United States and Canada, for who the terror famine is an article of faith and communal relying point. For decades after the fact, their obsession was confined to journals. Only of the late has it achieved a sort of mainstream credibility. In Harvest of Despair, shown on PBS and the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation and numerous college campuses. In Harvest of Sorrow, Oxford University Press account by Robert Conquest in a human rights curriculum now available to every 10th grade social studies teacher in the New York State, and in federal funding, Ukraine Famine Commission now in the 2nd year of hearings. After 50 years on the fridge, the Ukrainian famine debate is finally front and center. While one note faminologists may teach us a little real history, they reveal how a sense of history is pulled by political fashion until it's hardest into the taffy of conventional wisdom, and how you can fool most of the people most of the time, especially when you tell them that they want to hear. In conclusion, we really ought to note that there was no Holodomor, as the Ukrainian nationalists and Ukrainian Nazis would have tried to believe it today. According to them, there was a man-made famine in the Ukraine in 1932 and 1933 that led 6 million Ukrainians dying. The harvest was excellent, but the evil Stalinists confiscated all the grain to starve the people due to their resistance to collectivization. This is a view that Americans have been fed their entire lives by the control of U.S. propaganda media. Please cross-apply the evidence that this story was originally created by William Randolph Hearst to sell the newspaper in 1930. Please also cross-apply the pictures that so-called suffering people were taken during another famine of the 1920s in the Ukraine, or even people in the U.S. during the 1930s. Create evidence that was not a problem for Hearst. If he liked the story, he would create evidence himself. Cross-apply that many in the Ukraine were horrified of the fact that their fellow countrymen actually welcomed the Nazi German invaders as liberators in World War II and had used Stalin's creative famine as rational, that Russia forced them into that relationship. Most historians completely reject the notion that USSR intentionally starved anyone to death in order to punish them for restricting states' directives. That was the famine in 1933, and it continued for a few years afterwards. But extended over most of the USSR and now confined to the Ukraine, the government was not happy about the famine and took severe measures to curtail it. Most die of disease after being weakened by famine, not starvation itself. Poor decisions were made by state, but historically, this is often the cause during faminism. One can argue that the famine was caused by state policies, in particular effort to jump colonization and do it very rapidly. However, a very similar effort in China in 1959 and 1962 also caused a famine and led to 150 million deaths against mostly from disease. These seems to be a pattern of too rapid colonization, agriculture causing disastrous famines in communist countries. It may be structured weakens within the communist system of government control of large-scale agriculture. This could completely wipe out the argument that Stalin was responsible because Stalin didn't create communists. Karl Marx did. There was also an armed struggle going on, with bands of Kukas talking up against party officials, collective farms and farmers, etc. In the course of this armed struggle, the state that killed 390,000 people, mostly Ukrainians. If you want to call this mass murder or genocide or whatever, you're entitled to do that. But that's not what Harlem or Crowd argue. Also, there was a widespread sabotage in the USSR around this time, mostly in the Ukraine again, whereby those resistant cultivation destroyed 50% of the livestock in the USSR, a good part of the grain crop too. The reason for the famine and the story of the famine itself are quite complex and goes beyond the scope of this post. From now, this review by Mark Tauger, a recent book by Davis and Wheatcroft, perhaps some of the famine in the U.S. during this period to the best of knowledge. Instead of summarizing this complicated review, I will just link it and let you read it yourself. On a real note, it appeared that Ukraine Nazis Holodomor crowd has taken over an article called Holodomor Denial. It pretty much ruined it. Most of the people accused of Holodomor deniers to acknowledge that there was a famine in the USSR during the period that killed at least 1 million people. Walter Duranty, the famous New York Times columnist, acknowledged that 3 million deaths from famine. Douglas Totley, Mario Sosa, and Jeff Conlon, all supposedly Holodomor deniers, according to this outrageously biased article, all agreed that from 1 and 2 million died from a famine in the USSR during this period. The reason that the Ukraine Nazis had even come with this phrase, Holodomor denial, is apparent, the Jewish Holocaust denial. The Holodomor was given that name in the late 1980s by the Ukrainian nationalists in Canada, most of them who supported the Nazis and often fought beside in World War II. Anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial are rampant amongst the fascist supported. Was there a famine? Yes. Was there Holodomor? No. The most responsible estimate for the deaths due to the famine rage of 1.5 to 6 million over a few years across much of USSR. It is interested that the private correspondent, Robert Conquest, who from decades insisted that the famine was intentional, admitted in private correspondence with Davies and Wheatcroft of that famine was not intentional. It's truly sad that what is now regarded as settled fact among responsible historians is regarded as wild, unheard of propaganda in much of the West. But when we get back to the wonderful American free press again, right? In summary, let us look at the facts. The Holodomor was created by William Randolph Hearst in the mid-1930s, recreated by the movie Harvest of Despair in the 1980s. Both us created facts, inflated numbers, and whose purpose was not to report the truth, but create the truth. Can you have genocide or crimes against humanity simply on someone say so? Can you have facts that are created to tell stories and drive a conviction when we know that there's facts were just created to sell stories in the first place? Were there deaths in the Ukraine? Yes. Were their conditions bad? Yes. Was it genocide? No. Thank you.
Hello again. My name is Jacob Shaw, and I'll be delivering our second speech today. If it will please the court, I represent Joseph Stalin in this trial today. Please supply all my partner Elijah Matsuzuma's arguments about this not being a genocide, and that the facts of most of this are either created evidence or circumstantial evidence, and that was completely turned around to suit the needs of people pushing the story, not the needs of seeking the truth. Much of the latest push for the recognition of the Holodomor having from right-wing Ukrainian political people who want to distance themselves from their former USSR rulers. How better to do that than to show the people how bad communism was? In 2006-2008, the Ukrainian government launched a trial in Kiev about the Holodomor. Kiev's Court of Appeals has found Joseph Stalin and other Bolshevik leaders guilty of genocide against Ukrainians during the famine, or Holodomor, as it is called in Ukraine in 1932-33. Criminal proceedings against leaders of totalitarian rule, Stalin, Molotov, Kankovich, Bushevs, Kosor, Kubar, and Gachevich, were dropped over the suspects' deaths. Moscow was quick to react. The decision is part of a plan aimed at initiating a war with Russia, said the Speaker of Russia's State Duma, Boris Krylov. Krylov, one of the leaders of the United Russia Party, believed that such a plan had been on the road for several years now. The idea of the Holodomor and the idea of the Soviet genocide against Ukrainian people in the 1930s is absolutely groundless, the politician said. Unfortunately, there are times when economic conditions lead to crop failure, and that's exactly what happened in the 30s in the USSR. Krylov pointed out that the entire Soviet population suffered the consequences of the poor harvest, not only the Ukrainians. According to Kiev's authorities, they just moved to simply show that the Russia treats Ukrainian people badly, he concluded. It is not news that the mass famine was a result of criminal action of the state's leadership. The head of the State Foreign Affairs Committee, Konstantin Koshev, told Interfax news agency, "There is no need to artificially separate Ukraine from the rest of the former USSR," he added. "It is absolutely obvious that the Kiev court's marginal ruling is politicized," he said, "and provides no substantiated evidence of genocide against Ukrainian people." Koshev, who also heads the Russian delegation to the Council of Europe's Parliamentary Assembly, or PACE, said that on January 25th, a report on the famine in the USSR in the 30s will be presented. That document will become a far more significant and important event in the discussion of the famine issue, he said. In preparing the report, Koshev noted the speaker visited not only Ukraine, but also Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. In December 2008, the Council of Europe said the hunger that killed millions in the Soviet Union cannot be described as genocide and targeted the Ukrainian people. Therefore, the word genocide was removed from the draft report on the famine put forward by Ukraine. I am firmly convinced that the decision is part of the incumbent Ukrainian heads of state, Yushchenko's presidential campaign and his desperate attempt to remain in power, he said, as quoted on its official website. Meanwhile, it is a busy time for the armed revolution leader as the presidential race nears its finish line, and Yushchenko has hours left to attract more voters. Yushchenko's popularity is at a rock bottom. It is almost impossible that anything will change before Election Day on January 17th. Some analysts believe Yushchenko decided to play his last trump card with the genocide case. On Thursday, Yushchenko called for the creation of an international tribunal for communist crimes. The presidential press service reported that he asked leaders of Eastern European countries that were hurt by communist regimes such as Russia, Poland, Jordan, Baltic states, and others to sign an international agreement on the creation of such a tribunal, outline the principles of its creation and activities, and charter. The Ukrainian presidential press service reported on Thursday. Ukraine claims that 3.9 million people of its own people died during the famine. According to some of the state's nationalist parties, Russia, as successor of the USSR, should bear responsibility for the famine. Since Yushchenko's loss of power, and quit looking at the Holodomor has changed. No additional countries have accepted these creative facts, and the European Union Parliament has refused on every occasion possible, in 2 reports even called it genocide. Was the last attempt to create a genocide used by politicians within Ukraine to just obtain votes and serve nationalistic feelings? Even Solzhenitsyn, and there was no greater hater of the USSR and Stalin alive, admits that there was no Holodomor, casting the Holodomor lie as a lie that only the West could believe. I am uncertain about some of the conclusion of the study, that Stalin deliberately starved people to death in order to export for industrialization. The claims of the Holodomor Ukrainian Nazis or Ukrainian nationalists or whatever they are, that Stalin deliberately targeted Ukraine for genocide via famine in order to crush Ukrainian nationalism. This exposes the lie that we always said it was. And true figures for the famine are looking more like 3.5 million dead, 1.75 million in the Ukraine and 1.75 million elsewhere. It's looking more like what observers to the ground were estimating. Keep in mind that Russian journalists traveled to Ukraine to hide this famine. They heard that things were titled right, and there's a lot of hunger and little movement in a lot of the towns, but it's a few, if any, obviously starving people. One reporter saw one boy in the line at a medical clinic in a Ukrainian city that was obviously overweight. But most deaths were due to disease, not starvation. Sanitation and medical care were primitive at the time. At the time, it was estimated that 1 to 2 million Ukrainians died. But consider this. If Stalin's industrialization process had not proceeded as it did, Stalin could never defeat the Nazis, and Russia killed 89% of the Nazi orcs killed in the war. If Stalin did not defeat the Germans, the whole outcome of the war becomes uncertain. So, even if Ukraine was supported for industrialization, the result was that the West and the rest of the world was saved from Nazi menace. Now ponder that. Repeat after me. There was no Holodomor. There was no Holodomor. There was no Holodomor. There was no Holodomor. The Holodomor is a terror famine that never happened. We're in the Holodomor narrative. Now official state policy of the Ukraine, and also recognized officially by the United States, there was a bumper harvest in Ukraine in 1932. However, to punish the Ukrainians who resisted collectivization, the USSR confiscated the wheat crop, herded the people into villages that were more like concentration camps, and denied them food there. The terror famine, or deliberate famine, resulted in the deaths of 5 to 10 million Ukrainians and broke the back of the anti-collectivization movement there. However, this narrative simply never occurred. It never happened. What happened instead was harvest failure followed by other problems. Most had disease in a malnourished state. There were few actual deaths of hunger. We will now attack each of the underlying aspects of the prosecution's case. Now, I'm not a specialist on the Ukrainian famine, but I am familiar with recent research by several scholars on the matter, and think rather deeply a lot of the broad research that Mark Tagar has conducted over many years. That familiarity leads me to believe that there are no simple answers to this. A man-made famine is not the same thing as a deliberate terror famine. A famine originally caused by crop failure and aggravated by poor policies is man-aggravated, but only partially man-made. Why in this field do we always insist on absolutes, especially categorical, binary, and polemical ones? True, false, good, evil, crop failure, man-made? Reminds me of the Stalinist approach. Many questions have ambiguous answers. First, why was Ukraine sealed off by Soviet authorities? Not necessarily to punish Ukrainians. It was often to prevent starving people from flocking into non-famine areas, putting pressure on scarce food supplies there, and thereby turning a regional disaster into a universal one. This is also the original reason for the internal passport system, which was adopted in the first instance to prevent the movement of hungry and desperate people and with them to spread a famine. Second, all foreign journalists, if even Stalin apologists like Durenti, refused access to the famine areas. Well, for the same reason that U.S. journalists are no longer allowed in U.S. combat zones, such as the Gulf War and Afghanistan since Vietnam. No regime is anxious to take the chance on bad press if they can control the situation otherwise. Third, why was aid from other countries refused? Obviously, the non-imperialists a chance to trumpet the failure of socialism. Certainly, politics triumphed over humanitarianism. Moreover, in the growing paranoia of the times, and based on experience in the Civil War, the regime believed that the spies came along with relief administration. Fourth, while I read your stories of families who tried to take supplies by the regions to help their families through the period of having all foodstuffs confiscated that they crossed back into famine regions. If I am believed, reasonably I think, the speculators were trying to take advantage of the disaster by boiling up food in non-famine but nevertheless food-short regions, moving into the Ukraine and selling it at a higher price. In true Bolshevik fashion, there was no nuanced approach to this. No distinction between thousands of speculators and everybody was stopped. As a point one above, regimes facing famine typically try to contain the disaster geographically. Is that the same thing as intending to punish the victims? Fifth, if it was a harvest failure, why was the burden of that failure not simply shared across the Soviet Union? Well, it was. No region had a lot of food in 1932-33. Food was short and expensive everywhere. Everybody was hungry. With the best suggestions, I do not mean to make excuses or apologize for the Stalinists. Their conduct in this was erratic, incompetent, and cruel, and millions of people suffered unimaginably and died as a result. But it is too simple to explain everything when a Bolshevik such evil people explanation more suitable to children than that of scholars. It was much more complex than that. Although the situation was aggravated in some ways by Bolshevik mistakes, their attempts to contain the famine once it started were not entirely stupid, nor necessarily gratuitously cruel. As always did, by the way, allegedly cut grain exports and did, by the way, send food relief to Ukraine and other areas. It was too little too late, but there is no evidence, aside from constantly repeated assertions by some writers, that it was a deliberately inflicted terror famine. Sixth, finally, to deny the Jewish genocide quite rightly brings opprobrium. Clearly, to deny the terror famine, not 32 ought to provoke the same response. This is a position that I personally find grotesque, insulting, and at least shallow. Nobody is denying the famine or the huge scale of suffering, as Holocaust deniers do. Least of all, Tagar and other researchers who have spent much of their careers trying to bring this tragedy to light and give us a factual account of it. Admittedly, what hearing how the scholars do is different from the work of journalists and polemicists who would indiscriminately collect horror stories and layer them between the repetitive statements about evil, piling it all up and calling it history. In conclusion, the only thing we can conclude is that there was a famine, not a genocide. You must feel Joseph Stalin not guilty of genocide. Joseph Stalin may have been a great many things, but as creator of a Holocaust, he was not. Thank you for your time. And at this time, we've concluded our case for Joseph Stalin, and we're open up to questions on this matter.
Okay, so we like to start all. We can start maybe with a question.
Yes, so would you like us to start with the first question?
Okay. So you state that there was no genocide as a whole. How can you explain that some people from another countries, like George Bernard Shaw, while visiting Ukraine, were deeply impressed of happy Ukrainians? He actually had a favorable impression, which he disseminated to the world. However, he also claimed that there was a hunger, but no genocide. So, what caused, if it wasn't a show, what caused such an impression of the George Bernard Shaw and other celebrities all over the world? Thank you.
Well, specifically on an aspect of the hunger situation, we see that first I want to point out that the spread of hunger wasn't just in the Ukraine, and the starvation wasn't just in the Ukraine. It was also present in the USSR as well. And many people of Stalin's own people that died as a result of the hunger and the famine. But the same drastic effects of the collectivization program that were happening in the Ukraine were also present in the USSR. And certainly no one's accusing Stalin of causing genocide against his own people. If anything, there was a man-aggravated famine against his own people and Ukrainians as well. So in that aspect, first, it would have been just simply a famine and not genocide. But second is also you have to look at the intent. For genocide to be present as defined by the Geneva Convention, there must be an intent by the person in question to eliminate a particular race or to completely degrade them of their identity. That wasn't necessarily Stalin's approach or Stalin's goal. Stalin's goal was to collect grain for industrialization, to export, and then fund better for his war against Germany, which he was able to do so by his programs. Unfortunately, it had the effect or direct effect of hurting his own people and Ukraine. And third, on the final aspect, even with the hunger and starvation, most people did not die directly as a result from not receiving grains or from being in a malnourished state. Most died out of the purported number of those Ukrainians died were from disease, from the primitive sanitation and medical care that were present in the areas at this time that weren't up to par with what was going on for their distress. So with those two reasons, we say that again, it wasn't a genocide based on hunger aspect. The first question I have for you, I'd say is, do you believe that without Stalin's actions with the collectivization program, that he would have been able to win the war against Nazi Germany?
Okay, thank you for your question. I think my counselor will answer it.
So, we thoroughly understood from your speech that as far as you're concerned, that during that period of time, there was no existence of Holodomor in Ukraine because you strongly believe that there was a famine caused by several diseases and especially epidemics, which had the most considerable impact on the situation with the Holodomor at this period of time. Yeah. And what's more, you also mentioned about the non-Yeltsin years of the period. But however, when it concerns the First World War, even before the period of Holodomor and before the Second World War, several scientists have claimed that there was also a huge and terrible disaster of non-Yeltsin years diseases. And due to this, taking this fact into consideration, and it becoming deeply admired and analyzing the political situation which occurred to Ukraine at that period of time, we're deeply convinced that even at that certain years, as the Ukrainian nation had a relative possibility moral superiority to reject the probable outcome of being of a ridiculous disaster of the Second World War, but to the best of to the best of our knowledge, it wasn't the famine and especially the Holodomor which have the most opportunity to regret the coming political situation that have taken place throughout the world. And we just like you for 1 minute to be accustomed with that situation, especially the system of internal passports prevent Ukrainian people from leaving their towns and villages. These villagers were just not able to cross the border and escape the torment of fleeing to other countries. When the news of famine reached the Ukrainian diaspora in the United States and Europe, and also in Germany, food supplies were sent to Ukraine to assist the surrounding people. However, all food shipments were denied at the border by Soviet authorities. And to these reasons, we strongly believe that it has the most terrible impact at the political situation of the years, and even despite the fact of upcoming the Second World War, we are now as we are concerned, there were several optional ways in order to prevent it and save the Ukrainian territories starving at the Holodomor, and not just a simple famine which occurred during the previous centuries in all other countries, and it also have happened to our nation of the first global world war, but it didn't. So in this case, we are convinced that the Holodomor of 1932 and 33 was a huge global Holodomor the world has known.
And our next question, second question, is concerned about the lie. While police and Communist Party officials remain quite well fed, desperate Ukrainians ate leaves of bushes and trees, killed dogs, cats, frogs, mice, and birds, and cooked them. Also, there was the issue of the cannibalism. Do you really believe that Soviet Union, with lots of territories, didn't have a harvest, or it was a harvest of all over those latitudes? And it seems to me that it couldn't happen. Such a big territory and no harvest. Do you believe in it, or you not? Thank you.
Well, I believed it was a bad harvest for everyone at that time. During that time in 32 to 33 in that area, excuse me, there wasn't because of the economic downturn for both countries, it directly caused a bad harvest. And further, there was need for the collectivization program. It wasn't the smartest program to cause a better harvest or prevent a bad harvest, but certainly the only sense we would have here that a bad harvest was taking place. And because of that, again, the suffering isn't implicitly on the Ukraine, but it would extend to USSR as well, because they suffered just as much, if not worse. And our next question for you would be, what do you have to say about all the inflated numbers of persons who were seen to be starving and killed in the Ukraine, as most of you talked earlier, for example, of how this issue hasn't been heavily diagrammed and heavily popularized in society enough. But if you're talking about the United States, because of guerrilla journalism, it's been completely made as genocide and completely inflated the numbers of persons who were seen dead. So what do you have to say to all the yellow journalism and all the media and the propaganda that's going on about this issue?
I'm sorry, we had technical problems. Can you please repeat your question?
Certainly. So our question was, what do you have to say to all the propaganda and yellow journalism that's made this issue seem much worse? For example, it's impacted the United States very negatively because Stalin's literally been seen as the devil because of this.
Okay, thank you for your question. I think that the propaganda is really important issue too, because just Ukrainian ethnicals and nationalists, how you call them, refused to consider the ideology of the communists. And that was the whole collision and a conflict. Because just Communist Party officials didn't accept the answer of the people of Ukraine. Yes, we have our independence. Yes, we had our own religion, ideology, and we didn't want to accept this propaganda. And also, um, by the spring of the 1933, the height of the famine, an estimated 25,000 persons died every day in Ukraine. Intelligence was perished. And while you stated that most people all over the USSR were starving too, they were starving only because they couldn't just went to another country, and only because they live at the territory of the Ukraine ethnical, like Cuban or the central of Ukraine, like Kiev, Kharkiv, and other cities. So this was only the problem of their place. Uh, they chose to live there. That was their choice. So that's our answer. And my counselor wants to add some information too about the stats, about the numbers of the harvests they had. Actually, it was higher than the average number of harvests for the last years. So,
Yeah, you've mentioned claims that one of the most considerable impacts of the situation in Ukraine was caused by hunger. However, to the best of our knowledge and historical scientific achievements of the situation of that period of time, we can strongly convince you that at that time, the hunger was caused by different systematic diseases of just having nothing to eat. And as we mentioned before, there wasn't possibility for the Ukrainians to migrate to other territories in order to survive at these ridiculous conditions which occurred to our territory at this time, because more than 10 million people died as a result of violent executions, deportation, and starvation. And while we are considering the hunger topic, which is thought by you as is not being a Holodomor, it's also important to mention that the famine was caused by systematic diseases which not appear just after the first global world war, but each year and every month during the 1930s. And taking this reason into consideration, would like to conclude that the fact of this systematic starvation cost a global Holodomor, and me and my colleague were deeply convinced that people's roles role, especially the main nation who also suffered from this terrible conditions during their during this period of existence, should better understand the global issue which has never been considered more since the Ukrainian culture of 1930s. Don't you think so?
and yes, you said that there are researchers who believe that the famine was directed against the citizens of Soviet Ukraine and not against the Ukrainian national team. However, there is also one scientist who was a father of the United Nations Genocide Convention, Raphael Lemkin, and he described the destruction of the Ukrainian nation and a classic example of genocide, Holodomor. For the Ukrainian is not never have been a Russia. His culture, his temperament, his language, his religion are all different. To eliminate Ukrainian nationalism, the Ukrainian peasantry was sacrificed. The famine was necessary for the Soviet, and so they got one to order. If the Soviet program succeeds completely, if the intelligentsia, the Ukrainian intellectuals, the price and the peasant can be eliminated, Ukraine will be as dead as every Ukrainian were killed, or it will have lost the part of it which has kept and developed its culture, its beliefs, its common ideas, which have guided and given in itself which ensured their detonation. This is not a simple case of mass murder, it is a case of genocide, of the destruction not of individuals only, but of a culture and a nation. Thank you. Oh, have you got a question?
For this time,
Okay.
So, our first response to this is that clearly the statements you just presented are emblematic of the results of propaganda on this issue. Because those only arguments can come from those who are victims of the propaganda. For example, the 5 to 10 million Ukrainians who are purported to have died is simply a false number. The real numbers are, again, looking about 3.5 million Ukrainians who have died. We know this not only because such as scholars who have done extensive research and devoted their entire lives and careers to defining this issue and bringing it to light and actually discovering what's happened, such as Mark Tagar and others, but ground reporters who literally went on the scenes and saw the conditions of the Ukraine at this time and was actually involved with coordinating real events as they happened there and coordinating real coverage there, saw that the inflated numbers were completely false and were significantly lower. But also, if you really want to count the numbers who have died, starvation and hunger was not the main factor, main cause of death. It, in fact, was disease. We can see that from the malnourished states of persons that were there, as well as the fact that we knew that there was primitive sanitation medical care for all persons involved in the area.
Interrupting you, we had technical problems again. Can you please repeat the first part of your speech? Thank you.
All right, so just to get back to what I was saying, what we were specifically saying was that clearly the statements that you've taken today on this issue are a result of propaganda, emblematic of the propaganda in this issue, because the numbers of Ukrainians that were reported to have died, such as 5 to 10 million, is an inflated number. It simply isn't true, and it couldn't be possible. Not only has Mark Tagar and other scholars who devoted their whole careers and times to this issue and bringing this tragedy to light shown that those numbers are increasingly lower, only about 3.5 million Ukrainians were actually dead, and only about half of those, or less than that, were actually died from a direct result of the mad aggravated famine. Most were, in fact, did die from disease, from primitive medical and sanitation available at the time. Even most of the Russians in the USSR who died were from disease as well. This is because sufficient aid was not being sent. Even when other countries were sending foodstuffs, as the United States, to the Ukraine, it was doing little to help. But if medical care would have been sent, it would have done a whole lot better. We see that the main issue here was were doctors, nurses, and other personnel who just weren't available at the time in the Ukraine to help them out and to help them recover from what was happening. The grain was truly the real problem and the huge factor which was killing them. Then other measures would have been taken and the alternatives would have been met. But clearly that wasn't the central and crucial issue. And we observed that the propaganda had not been developing and had been a cloud and atmospheric around this whole issue, then it would have been decided a lot sooner first. And second, you'd see that the end effects were much clearer. That because of the collectivization program, Stalin was able to kill 89% of the Nazi orcs, essentially winning the war, World War II, especially since most of his own people suffered the most casualties. Actually, he suffered the most casualties for the war. And last third, we see that not only is the collectivization program not a genocide, it did have some reverse effects. For example, the USSR under Stalin did eventually send relief and food supplies and food like, for example, to the Ukraine following this event. I'm seeing how much suffering had been going on. And after Stalin could attend to his own country and his own people who were also suffering. It was too little too late, we admit, but it wasn't absolutely groundless or unwise for Stalin to do so. And we believe we have no further questions for you today. So if there are no further questions on either side, we're more than happy to end the debate, and thank you for your time today. Can you hear us all right?
I told them that we don't believe it.
Yeah. Don't tell them you don't believe what she said. Tell them.
Why are they gonna
We had some technical problems, and as we can see, we won't have a conclusion today, but we can probably have it when we have a mock trial. So we are just going to have another one debate day. So are you agree with it? Would you like to arrange with us another trial?
Yes, that would be great. We look very forward to that.
Tell them that you don't really believe this.
And let's thank you for your time today and the great debate. This is always wonderful to have and so fun to engage in these past issues. And we'd like to make it known that we actually don't agree with the position we took today, but for the purpose of the debate, we argued as if we did. But we understand the trauma that Stalin caused for the Ukraine and the genocide that actually took place there. I did. Thanks. Position.
Thank you for these debates. It was very pleasant to have such a good opponent. We hope that we will have next trial soon. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, and we're very convinced that our today's debate will have brilliant impact for the further development of our teamwork in order to reach the most in order to reach the most appropriate conclusion and this specific topic. And so, thank you so much for your work, and see you the next time.
Until next time.
Bye.
All right, tell them.
Merry Christmas. Happy holidays.